this conflict started with, of course, this modern iteration of it on February 24th, when the Russians initiated the special military operation. It was done with limited number of troops. I think everybody was surprised that the Russians attempted something of the scope and scale with about 200,000 troops, plus or minus 10,000. As the Russians moved in on Kiev, there's a lot of people talking about, Kiev's going to fall. And I and others are looking at it going, but there's like millions of people there, and the Russians are coming down with like 60,000 guys. You don't take a city of several million with 60,000 guys. It doesn't work that way. And it turns out that what the Russians were doing wasn't trying to take Kiev, it was to put pressure on the Ukrainian government to get them to the negotiating table, which they did. 6 days after the special military operation began, Ukraine went to the first negotiation in Gomel, Belarus. They did a total of 3 there. They did another one in Turkey. I think Antalya, or it could be another city, but the Lavrov met with his Ukrainian counterpart. They initialed an agreed upon settlement for a ceasefire, went back, got it vetted, and they were supposed to meet on 1 April and end the war. That was what Russia's objective was. It wasn't to conquer Ukraine. And how do we know? Because the document clearly says that if you sign this, Russia will withdraw from all territories that were occupied after February 24th. Imagine that. They're not out for territory acquisition. They just wanted Ukraine not to be part of NATO. Number one thing in the thing, you won't be part of NATO. The Russians were not, they didn't have too many demands on demilitarization at that time. They denazification. They weren't going to touch. They just no NATO. That's all they wanted. On the issue of the Donbass, Lugansk and Donetsk, basically the document said, look, they declared their independence before the special military operation began. We can't touch that. This is a sovereignty issue. What we'll do, however, is we'll get the Russian troops out of there. We'll bring it over to the international community, and in accordance with United Nations principles of self-determination, there will be a referendum, and the people of this area, Ukrainian, Russians alike, will vote and decide, do they want to be part of Ukraine, part of Russia, or independent? On Crimea, they said that'll always be Russia. You're never getting that back, but we're willing to work with you so that the Ukrainian government has some sort of say in what goes on inside Crimea towards Ukrainians, people who identify as Ukrainians. So, we're going to respect that and give them some sort of autonomy. They talked about security guarantees, the whole thing. Imagine if the Ukraine had signed that today, where they'd be. They wouldn't have lost any territories. 400,000 guys would be alive. 20 million people wouldn't be displaced. $1 trillion worth of infrastructure. The whole works. But no, NATO told them no. So now at that point, Russia's special military operation had to change. Remember, they shifted into phase 2. Phase 2 was basically the recapture of the Donbass. To do that, they also had to take the land bridge, Kherson, Zaporizhia, for logistics and sustainability, but they hadn't integrated that yet, meaning that once they secured the Donbass and they probably would have withdrawn from those territories too. But NATO throws in tens of billions of dollars, US $45 billion Lend-Lease package, if you remember that, in May, and they rebuild the Ukrainian army, which had been devastated by this action. 246,000 active duty troops were gutted by this. So we rebuild it. We launch a counterattack. And remember, during this time, part of the good faith measure that the Russians did as part of the ceasefire was to withdraw their troops from Kiev, withdraw their troops from Sumy. And in Kharkov, they started the process of withdrawal in anticipation of an agreement being signed. And they took half of the troops out. So you have a sparsely defended line in Kharkov. And this new rebuilt army comes sweeping in and pushes them back to their current defensive positions. The Russians still have a problem. They started with 200,000 guys. They suffered some casualties, thousands of dead, thousands of wounded. How to reinforce now? So Russia makes a decision in September, October to mobilize 300,000 reservists, mobilized, partial mobilization. They also opened the doors for volunteers. Another 300,000 Russians volunteered. They also did a couple ways of conscription during this time. A certain percentage of those conscripts signed contracts, so about 80,000. So we're per time. So we're looking at 160, 300, 760,000 new troops, fresh troops coming in. in addition to rotated troops. So you got a little bit less than 1 million Russian soldiers getting ready, getting organized, but it takes time. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are building up this new army to do something. Now, normally in the military, you like to keep your enemy guessing. That's a big deal. That's why we have classification, top secret, secret, things of that nature. But General Zelensky, the head of the Ukrainian forces, he has an interview with The Economist, and he does other interviews in December, and he says, I can beat these guys, meaning the Russians, but I need a lot of equipment. I need 300 tanks, 500 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 artillery pieces, unlimited ammunition. And he said, and with this, and here's the fun part, with this, we can capture Melitopol. So he named the objective to sever the land bridge so we can start to put pressure on Crimea. Now, this is where the Russians go, Melitopol. Look at a map. And you examine the map and you go, wow, the ideal line of communication is from this village called Robotyno, and then you go up to Tokmak, and then you go to Melitopol. So there's their axis of advance announced by Zelensky. So the Russians begin to build defenses, but it's not just any defense, because now they know, and remember, Zelensky defined the size of the force, basically 9 to 12 brigades. So they know the size of the force, they know the composition, Leopard tanks, Marder infantry vehicles, Strikers, Challengers, the whole thing. They know it all. They know who's doing it because this is a press event now. They're interviewing the soldiers in January as they're being trained in Grafenwohr. I'm from the 36th Brigade and we're training with this. I'm from the 47th. I'm the fighting 47th. We're the 82nd. We're going to sing a song to Stepan Bandera. This kind of thing going on. When the Russians went in 2022, the 58th Combined Arms Army coming out of southern Russia, they're the ones who helped, move out of Crimea do the land bridge, get up to Mariupol and all this. Their deputy commander was named, is a lieutenant general named Alexander Romanchuk, and he got pulled out of the lines and sent to the Combined Arms Academy to take some of his combat experience and use that to train up the next generation. But he was also tasked with taking a look, reimagining Russian defensive warfare doctrine, which they had inherited from the Soviets. They had modified it, but now within the scope and scale of this new defensive posture that Russia was taking after the Ukrainian counteroffensive of September, October, he said, reimagine it. And he did. And he wrote a paper. He published a paper in March of this year. And then they read the paper and said, that's a good paper. Guess what, Lieutenant General Alexander Romanchuk? You're leaving the Combined Arms Academy and you're going to Zaporizhia. And remember how Zelensky told us exactly where he's going to attack from? We want you to build up the defenses here. So take your new doctrine. We know where they're coming. We know how many troops they have. We know what the composition of it is. And we want you to build a defensive barrier to defeat this counteroffensive. And he did. And they did some interesting things here. Because, first you got to put yourself in the mind. The whole idea of defensive warfare is to try and you do intelligence preparation of the battlefield. You look at the terrain and see, what terrain is advantageous to you, how you want to use that terrain to shape the battle, to divert the flow of enemy forces, etc. But you also have to get the enemy to do what you want them to do. The 42nd Guards Motorized Rifle Division out of Chechnya, actually, it's a Russian unit but based in Chechnya. They participated in this war. They had a tough early fight. The 70th Regiment lost their commander. The 291st got beat up. And these units were pulled out and sent to the front lines in Zaporizhia because it was sort of a quiet sector after a while. And right about the village of Robotyno, remember, they know where they're coming. They took the 291st and the 70th. They put them right there where the Ukrainians are going to attack. Now, why would you do that? Because you know that Western intelligence is looking at this, and they have the order of battle data. They have the write-up of how it's performed, morale, and all that stuff. Both these units took casualties. Both received mobilized troops to bring them up to speed. And so some intelligence officer, probably like me, is looking at it going, whoa, look, guys, They took the 291st and the 70th, they put them side by side in Robottino. There's a scene there where there's not going to be effective command and control. And these mobilized troops don't want to be there. So when we put pressure on them, they're going to run away. And everyone went, yeah, that's what's going to happen. So they trained them up, they got them in, and they went up against the 291st and the 90th on June 4th, and they got slaughtered. Because what had happened is the Russian had lured them in to right where they wanted. They created the concept of weakness to attract that attack, and then they slaughtered them. And they've been slaughtering them ever since. And now what's happened as the Ukrainians commit to Robottino because they need it. So that battle, which should have taken about 3 days, really, because it's in the crumple zone. The Russians aren't supposed to fight and die. There's no Alamo mentality in Romanchuk's defensive doctrine. So they're sucking them in. The Russians are supposed to delay, pull back to a defensive position, delay, pull back. But instead, what would happen is they're killing so many of them that they would counterattack and recapture and force the Ukrainians to fight the same battle over and over and over again. So what should have been a 3-day battle for Robottino ended up dragging on for more than 2 months. The Ukrainians commit forces. It's 12 brigades, and they're going to work in 4 waves of 3 brigades. So 3 brigades attack. They are supposed to get up to the first defensive line and pierce it. You're going to lose steam. You're going to lose combat efficiency because you're going to take casualties. 3 more brigades come through, do a passage of line, penetrate the first defensive barrier, and push on to the second, where, again, they're going to lose steam. You take casualties, but they're going to expand the breach. 3 more brigades come in, and they're supposed to punch through and get to Tokmak and poise for Melitopol. And then the final 3 brigades, your elite forces, go racing through, capture Melitopol, the war is over. Well, in September, the final 3 brigades were thrown into the battle to take Robottino. And they did, because the Russians gave. There was nothing left. But now the Russians, Robottino's on the low ground. The Russians go back to the high ground. So they took Robottino. Now they're just getting the snot pounded them. They can't go anywhere. They're stuck. They can't go up the high ground. So what do? They shift to the left, shift north towards Verobovoy. I'm sure I'm butchering the name, but it's a road leading from Robottino there on the low ground. And they shift there and they start to attack in that direction because that's what the Russians wanted them to do. They're sucking them in, and it's also leading them away from Tokmak. So it's extending their line. They're getting slaughtered, and that's where we're at right now. There is no combat strength. These 31 tanks, these Abrams tanks, understand that the way the war is being fought today with the weaponry and everything, you don't come in with 31 tanks in a massed attack. The tanks right now are operating in pairs, sometimes in trios, sometimes 4. They come in, they move up, they do some fire support to advance infantry fighting vehicles, which dislodge infantry, who then move forward and gain a piece of terrain, drive the Russians out, hold on to it, take a pounding with artillery. If they can hold on to it long enough, they consolidate, and then they do it again. Tanks move in, fire support, etc. So these Abrams tanks will probably be, parceled out just like the Challengers, 2 here, 2 there. But it's like the Leopards, 2 here, 2 there. Well, the Leopards got slaughtered. The Challengers are getting slaughtered, and the Abrams will be slaughtered. They're not good tanks. These are old tanks. They're heavy. They're coming at the worst possible time. You should have introduced the Abrams late spring when you had the whole summer of dry terrain to maneuver on. But they're coming in right at the beginning of the Rasputitsa season, the muddy season. These are heavy tanks. They're going to bog down, and it's just going to be ugly. This counteroffensive is over. And the thing about the Russians is, now, this has been heavy fighting. I think we need to understand that when Vladimir Putin talks about Ukrainian casualties, he admits it's about a 10-to-1 casualty ratio. 10 for every 10 Ukrainians, there's 1 Russian. He said a while ago 71,000 Ukrainian casualties, which means there's 7,100 Russian casualties minimum. That's a lot of Russian casualties. The Russians have rotated in some of their reserves. I've been watching as they take these new regiments that they of mobilized troops. And I've seen at least 2 get committed in the 42nd Division's theater, area of operations, subordinated to the 42nd, which means they're rotating out the 291st to 70th to get them back there, get them up to strength, and then go into reserve. But they haven't committed the bulk of about 200,000 Russian reserves that are trained, organized, ready to rock. They haven't been committed. The Ukrainians are out of everything. They don't have anything left. They got 31 Abrams. That's it. they threw in their last elite brigades to try and take Robotyno and shift over. They're done now. There's no oomph left in this thing. The counteroffensive is over. Um, and it's been a strategic defeat for the Ukrainians, for the collective West. And I think what we're going to see now is that the Russians, having absorbed the Ukrainian blow, are going to slowly go on the counteroffensive and begin to put pressure on the Ukrainians. The idea is you attack here, force Ukrainians to send reserves over there. Now, remember, the Russians have 200,000 reserves they can send in, so they can plus up troops here, attack. Ukrainians don't have anybody left, so they're going to have to steal troops, rob Peter to pay Paul, send troops up to fill that gap. And the Russians are monitoring that. And they say, well, they're thin here. Let's hit here. Now they break through. They have to steal more units. The Ukrainians come in to seal that break. But that means there's a weak spot up here. The Russians then will attack there. The Russians will be on the initiative from now on. And eventually the Ukrainian line is going to collapse. And they're probably going to have to retreat beyond the Dnieper River and surrender a whole bunch of territory to the Russians. That's the direction this thing's going. And I just think that, the Ukrainians have suffered a strategic defeat, and that means the collective West has suffered a strategic defeat. A lot of people talk now about a frozen war. That's what they want. They want to freeze the war. Why in God's name would Russia freeze the war? A frozen war implies we need to catch our breath. Russia doesn't need to catch their breath. Russia has been doing everything right. They've been absorbing everything that NATO and Ukraine was throwing at them without suffering heavy casualties. I mean, they've suffered significant casualties, but nothing like the Ukrainians. Combat units that suffer between 50 and 69% casualties become combat ineffective. The vast majority of the Ukrainian brigades that have been committed to this counteroffensive become combat ineffective, which means they had to be pulled back and they have to suck resources that could have otherwise been used to create a new reserve force, suck them in to get those units back up to speed. We've seen brigades being rotated out 3 to 4 times during this counteroffensive, which means 3 to 4 times this brigade's about 4,000 or 5,000 guys, has suffered between 50 and 70% casualties. Do the math. That's a lot of casualties. The Russians, on the other hand, they've had some units take some hits. They've rotated them out, but they have fresh, intact units to come in and plug those holes, and they still have a whole bunch of those fresh units to use as they see fit. And that's the direction right now. War is an extension of politics by other means. And I've always said that while the Russians will defeat the Ukrainian army, this war won't end until you have a political solution. And I always believe that what would happen is first the Ukrainian army would be destroyed, and then you'd see the collapse of the Ukrainian government. But things are looking like maybe the collapse of the Ukrainian government may come first. I don't know. Did you see the interview that Zelensky's wife gave recently?
Yes. I have the clip of the very last question. It's only about a minute. Maybe we should play it because I think
it's a good time to play it. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's incredibly telling of where things are in the conflict. Let me find
and politically.
Yes, politically. So here it is. Here's Face the Nation. All right, I'm not for copyright purposes, I won't max screen it, but let's play the video. This is just I have it fast forwarded to the very last question where she's going to ask about what she would think about her husband, Vladimir Zelensky, running in 2024, which, mind you, I just want to point out to the audience, this is something the United States is pressuring. This is not necessarily something Zelensky is saying, oh, we should have elections. That's, given the behavior of the Ukrainian government, I think it's quite clear that with all the opposition parties banned, that they don't want to have elections. Zelensky doesn't want them, but the U.S. has been pressuring this slowly but surely, especially in the last several months. So here we go.
President Zelensky and your family have become synonymous with Ukraine. When people in America think of Ukraine, they think of President Zelensky and your family. How would you feel about him running again in 2024 if elections are held?
Well, this is a very difficult question for me. Even when he ran for the first time, I didn't fully endorse it. But if he runs again, if he runs for the second time, if he decides that it is necessary, well, we have some experience. We've been there. It is not as scary as as it was in the first time. I don't know whether he has made this decision or not. It will depend on the situation in our country and the situation and the possibility of organizing free and fair elections. It will also depend whether our society would need him as a president. If he will feel that Ukrainian society will no longer wish him to be the president, he will probably not run. But I will support him, whatever decision he takes.
Whatever decision. Madam.
So,
look, how many wartime leaders could you imagine? You know, there's only been one in my experience, and that was Lyndon Johnson, who refused to run for a second term during the Vietnam War. And the main reason is because he realized the United States was losing in Vietnam, and he didn't. You know, he had been lied to by McNamara, and he had lost all confidence in his ability to go forward. But generally speaking, wartime leaders are like, rallying around me. I'm the guy. You know, boom. Winston Churchill, you know, running for election during the Second World War, kept winning. She sounded defeated, and this is the point. Zelensky is a defeated politician right now. Look, they have this major divorce taking place with Poland right now, which is huge. Nobody's really talking about it, but it's a deal. You see the Western European countries starting to say, we got nothing left for you. Europe is fractured. Even in the United States, you know, we have our entire budget being held hostage by Ukraine. That's going to lead to some sort of crisis unless a solution is found to this. But his days are done. And so what I think we're going to see sooner rather than later is we're going to see political collapse before we see military collapse. That's just a guess. And I think the Russians are looking at that, and they're thinking this, you know, if they agree, let's say if the Russians have a similar assessment, then they're not going to go pedal to the metal militarily, because they're sacrifice thousands of lives when you can accomplish what you want to accomplish simply by putting a little bit of pressure on and waiting for Zelensky to fall. If they thought Zelensky was a dug in, a wartime leader, impossible to evict politically, then you'd see the Russians taking more risks, I think, on the battlefield now that they've crushed the Ukrainian counteroffensive. But I think that we're probably going to see the Russians. There will be no frozen conflict. I mean, Lavrov and Putin have made that clear, that Russia, and there won't be a negotiated settlement. That has flown as well. What there will be is unconditional surrender. And that unconditional surrender will happen when Zelensky is removed, because he is an impediment to the conclusion of this conflict. He's no longer part of the solution. He's purely the problem. And, how he's removed is yet to be seen. I think for the sake of his wife and his kids, I'd like him to resign and flee the country. If he tries to hold on too long, I think he could find himself on the receiving end of the fury of Ukrainian officers who feel betrayed by his incompetence, especially when it becomes clear just how corrupt he is and how corrupt his government is. There's a growing, everybody knows it's there, but there's a growing resentment over this. There are people who aren't getting their pensions paid, people who aren't getting the health care they need because of the corruption. The United States is fully funding. There's the irony. Here in the United States, we have people who can't get health care. We have infrastructure problems. We have education problems, the whole thing. But in Ukraine, we're funding the entire country. We're paying every salary in the civil service. We're paying every salary in the military. We're funding the health care. We're funding their veterans affairs. We're funding we're paying the Nazi salaries. And as an American, I take umbrage at this. I'm like, wait a minute. If you're going to do that there, first do it here. Let's take care of the immigration problem. Let's take care of the dirty water up in Flint, Michigan. Let's take care of the homeless problem. Let's take care of all those junkies on the street in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Let's take care of America before we start taking care of Ukraine. It's going to become a political problem. And I think Zelensky sees the writing on the wall, and that's why his wife, that was not a happy woman answering that question. Everybody can read the body language for themselves, but that's not a woman that was overly confident in what the future held for her and her husband.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.